A Saturday morning in Surrey, a husband sits down at his own kitchen table for a meal his wife has just made him. It is an ordinary domestic moment, the kind repeated in that house for 31 years of marriage. He will not finish that meal. Within minutes, a hammer she has carried into the house in her handbag will strike him 20 times. She will cover his body with an old curtain, leave behind a note that reads simply, "I love you," and then drive for nearly 2 hours to the edge of a cliff, intending never to come back down from it. That would be a shocking enough story on its own, but it is only the beginning. This woman would go on to be convicted of murder. Years later, that conviction would be completely overturned, and in a final twist that almost no one saw coming, a British court would eventually rule that she was legally entitled to inherit everything that belonged to the very man she killed. This is the case of Richard Challen and his wife, Sally Challen. Now, if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found this channel. Every day, I dive deep into real criminal cases, breaking them down piece by piece so we can actually understand what happened and why. If that sounds like something you'd be into, go ahead and hit subscribe. It's free, and it means a lot. Okay, now let's get back to the case. Richard Challen was 61 years old. He had spent much of his working life as the owner of a car dealership in Richmond, in southwest London, before retiring to a quieter life in Surrey. To the wider community, he was a successful, established businessman, the kind of man whose career had provided comfortably for his family for decades. He and Sally had 2 sons together, James and David, and by 2010, both were grown men, old enough to have formed their own clear views of their parents' marriage. Richard's identity, to almost everyone who knew him professionally, was straightforward: a retired car dealer, a husband of over 3 decades, a father of 2. By the summer of 2010, Richard and Sally's marriage had been going through a difficult period. The couple had spent time living apart, and in the months before Richard's death, they had been attempting a reconciliation, trying, in their own way, to rebuild something that had clearly been under strain. Richard Challen died in his own home at the hands of the woman he had shared his life with for 31 years. What the trial that followed would reveal, layer by layer, was that the full story of that marriage was very different from the one visible to the outside world, and it is that fuller story we turn to next. It is worth pausing here to say something plainly. Whatever the fuller account of this marriage eventually revealed, Richard Challen was still a man with a full life outside of it, a business he had built, sons who mourned him, and a place in his local community that had nothing to do with what happened between him and his wife behind closed doors. That fact does not disappear simply because the story of his death turned out to be more complicated than it first appeared. Sally Challen, known to most as Sally, though born Georgina, was 56 years old at the time of Richard's death. She worked as an office manager, and by every outward account, she was simply the wife of a successful local businessman, a mother of 2 grown sons, a woman who had spent more than 3 decades inside the same marriage. That surface description conceals what would later become one of the most significant accounts of coercive control ever examined by a British court. According to evidence eventually presented on Sally's behalf, the roots of that control stretched back roughly 40 years, predating even the marriage itself. Richard, according to that evidence, subjected Sally to a sustained pattern of psychological abuse across the length of their relationship. He would regularly criticize her appearance and her weight, and make degrading, humiliating comments about her in front of friends and family. He limited who she was allowed to socialize with and enforced strict, controlling rules around their home. When confronted about his own behavior, he would deny it entirely and instead suggest that Sally herself was the one behaving irrationally, telling her at various points that she was either losing her mind or drinking too much, a pattern now widely recognized as gaslighting. Financial control formed another consistent thread. Sally had limited independent access to money throughout much of the marriage, a dynamic that left her reliant on Richard, not just emotionally, but practically, for the basic structure of her daily life. Even the attempted reconciliation in 2010 carried the same pattern. Richard set out conditions for their renewed relationship in writing, telling Sally he would only return to her if she stopped speaking to strangers and never interrupted him while he was talking. This is the shape coercive control so often takes. Not a single dramatic incident that anyone outside the marriage could point to, but a slow accumulation of control, criticism, and dependency stretched across decades. To friends and extended family, Sally and Richard still appeared, for most of those years, to be an ordinary long-married couple, because that is precisely how coercive control so often survives undetected for so long. It rarely announces itself. It simply narrows a person's world, year after year, until almost no one outside that world, including the person living inside it, can see how small it has become. By August of 2010, the attempted reconciliation between Richard and Sally was still fragile. They had been apart, come back together, under Richard's own terms, and Sally was, according to evidence heard years later, growing increasingly convinced that his commitment to rebuilding the marriage was not genuine. Central to that growing conviction was a suspicion that Richard was continuing to see other women, even as he asked Sally to accept strict new conditions for her own behavior. For a woman who had spent 4 decades adapting herself around one man's expectations, the belief that he might still be unfaithful, even now, represented the collapse of the one thing she had spent a lifetime trying to hold together. At Sally's original trial, prosecutors characterized this suspicion simply as jealousy, painting a picture of a woman consumed by resentment over her husband's friendships with other women. What that framing left out, at least at the time, was any meaningful exploration of the decades of control that had shaped how Sally experienced that suspicion in the first place. There was no dramatic public argument in the days before the 14th of August. Nothing that neighbors or friends later described as an obvious final straw. What existed instead was a private, internal breaking point, the product of 40 years of accumulated pressure, reaching its limit inside one ordinary-looking Surrey household. Researchers who study prolonged coercive control describe this exact pattern, not a single moment of provocation, but a slow, cumulative narrowing of a person's sense of any option other than the one they eventually take. On the morning of the 14th of August, 2010, that pressure reached its end. On the morning of Saturday the 14th of August 2010, Sally Challen arrived at Richard's home in Claygate, Surrey, carrying a hammer inside her handbag. As Richard sat at the kitchen table eating a meal she had prepared for him, Sally struck him with the hammer approximately 20 times. A post-mortem examination later confirmed that Richard died from severe blunt force trauma to the head. After the attack, Sally covered her husband's body with an old curtain and left behind a handwritten note. It read simply, "I love you, Sally." She then left the house and drove for close to 2 hours to Beachy Head, a well-known cliff edge in East Sussex. Shortly before 1 o'clock the following afternoon, she was spotted standing near the edge, roughly 500 feet above the sea below, apparently intending to take her own life. Officers from Sussex Police, along with chaplains, spent more than 3 hours attempting to talk with her. During that conversation, Sally confessed to killing her husband with a hammer. At around 4 o'clock that afternoon, she was persuaded to step back from the edge and was taken into custody. It was only around 1 o'clock on the 15th of August, roughly a day after the attack, that Richard's body was discovered at the house in Claygate, prompting a formal investigation by Surrey police. Sally was charged with murder and appeared at a preliminary hearing shortly afterwards. At her trial at Guildford Crown Court in 2011, she admitted to killing Richard but denied murder, arguing diminished responsibility due to an abnormality of mind. Prosecutors presented her as a woman driven primarily by jealousy over her husband's suspected infidelity, telling the jury she had once said that if she could not have him, no one would. The defense's account of decades of psychological abuse was heard, but at the time, without the legal concept of coercive control to frame it, the jury was left largely to weigh it against the prosecution's simpler narrative of a scorned and calculating wife. The jury found Sally Challen guilty of murder. She was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years to serve before being considered for release. At that point, as far as the law was concerned, the case was closed. It would not remain closed for long. Because Sally Challen never denied killing her husband, the physical evidence in this case was never used to establish who was responsible. Its purpose, both at her original trial and in everything that followed, was to help the court understand the nature and the intent behind what had happened. The post-mortem findings were central to the prosecution's original case. Richard's cause of death, severe blunt force trauma to the head, alongside the fact that he had been struck approximately 20 times, was used by prosecutors in 2011 to argue that this could not have been a single, momentary loss of control. Repeated, forceful blows, they argued, spoke to a sustained and deliberate act. The hammer itself carried significant weight as evidence. The fact that Sally had brought it with her, concealed inside her handbag, rather than picking up an object already present at the scene, became one of the prosecution's strongest arguments for premeditation at the original trial, a detail that would later sit in direct tension with the defense's account of a woman acting in a state of psychological collapse rather than calculated planning. Sally's own actions immediately afterwards were also treated as evidence in their own right. Covering the body and leaving a note reading, "I love you, Sally," was presented by prosecutors as evidence that she understood exactly what she had done. Her drive to Beachy Head and the confession she gave during more than 3 hours of negotiation with police and chaplains removed any question about who was responsible, while also documenting, in her own words at the time, her state of mind immediately after the killing. None of this physical evidence changed in the years that followed. What changed, when the case returned to court in 2019, was not the facts of what had happened in that kitchen, but the psychiatric and legal framework available to interpret why it had happened, a distinction that would ultimately prove decisive. It is worth noting how unusual this makes the case from a purely evidential standpoint. Most cases that are later overturned on appeal involve some form of new physical evidence, a forensic re-examination, a piece of testimony previously withheld. Here, every physical fact established in 2011 remained true in 2019. The hammer, the 20 blows, the note, the drive to Beachy Head, none of it was ever in dispute. What ultimately changed the outcome of this case was not what had happened, but the tools the legal system had available to explain it. As with any analysis of this kind, nothing here is intended as a clinical diagnosis of any individual involved. What follows is drawn from the psychiatric evidence and expert testimony presented across Sally Challen's legal proceedings, considered alongside broader research into coercive control and its psychological impact. At the center of this case sits one of the clearest documented examples of coercive control examined by any British court. Decades of criticism, isolation, financial dependency, and gaslighting do not tend to produce a single dramatic moment of realization in the person experiencing them. Instead, researchers describe a gradual erosion of a person's sense of their own judgment and reality. until their internal world becomes shaped almost entirely by their partner's version of events. The psychiatric evidence eventually presented on Sally's behalf concluded that she had been suffering from an adjustment disorder at the time of the killing, a condition understood to develop in response to significant and prolonged psychological stress. Combined with the decades-long pattern of control described by her family, experts argued this had substantially affected her ability to reason and to control her actions on the morning of the 14th of August. It is worth being precise about what this evidence did and did not argue. It did not suggest that coercive control excuses homicide, and English law has never treated it as a standalone defense to killing. What it argued, instead, was that decades of documented psychological abuse were directly relevant to Sally's mental state at the time. Evidence a court sitting in 2011 simply did not yet have the legal framework to properly weigh. That legal framework, and how it eventually changed everything about this case, is where we turn next. This is, in many ways, the defining psychological tension of the entire case. A woman capable of planning, bringing a weapon into the house concealed in her handbag, and later negotiating calmly for hours at a cliff edge, while also, according to the psychiatric evidence eventually accepted by the courts, acting under the weight of a mental state shaped by 40 years of sustained control. Reconciling those two realities, the apparent calculation and the underlying psychological collapse, is precisely what would occupy the courts for the better part of a decade. This tension is also why coercive control cases are so often misunderstood by the public. A person capable of planning a specific act can still, at the same time, be operating under a profoundly distorted sense of their own options and reality. The two are not mutually exclusive. Psychiatric experts who study prolonged psychological abuse describe this combination regularly: deliberate, purposeful action occurring within a mental state that has been shaped and constrained by years of control the person themselves may not even be able to fully recognize or name. There is a detail at the heart of this case that changes everything about how it should be understood, and it has nothing to do with the kitchen in Claygate. It has to do with the law itself. Formerly recorded as the Crown versus Georgina Challen, this case is now widely regarded as the first in British legal history in which the concept of coercive control was successfully used as part of a defense against a murder charge, a distinction that only became possible because of what happened next. When Sally Challen stood trial in 2011, coercive control was not a criminal offence in England and Wales. It was not a concept the jury was formally asked to consider, because it did not yet exist as a recognised legal category at all. That changed in December of 2015, while Sally was still serving her sentence, when the Serious Crime Act made coercive and controlling behaviour a crime in its own right for the very first time. Backed by her son, David Challen, and supported by the campaign group Justice for Women, Sally's legal team built an appeal around this new legal framework, combined with fresh psychiatric evidence about her mental state. In February of 2019, the Court of Appeal quashed her murder conviction entirely, ruling that the original jury had never been given the opportunity to understand her actions through the lens of coercive control, because that lens simply did not exist in law at the time she was tried. In June of 2019, rather than proceeding to a full retrial, the Crown Prosecution Service accepted Sally's plea of manslaughter by reason of diminished responsibility. She was sentenced to 9 years and 4 months, and because she had already served close to a decade in prison by that point, she walked free. Then, in May of 2020, came the final and perhaps most extraordinary twist in the entire case. English law includes something known as the forfeiture rule, designed to prevent anyone who unlawfully kills another person from financially benefiting from that person's death. High Court Judge Paul Matthews was asked to rule on whether that rule should apply to Sally in relation to Richard's estate. Considering the exceptional circumstances of decades of documented abuse, the judge waived the rule entirely, ruling that Sally Challen was legally entitled to inherit her late husband's estate. It is difficult to overstate how rare a ruling like this is. A woman who had killed her husband with a hammer was, by the full and final judgment of the English legal system, entitled to what he left behind. It is a conclusion that sits uncomfortably for many people, and reasonably so. It is also, in its own way, the clearest possible demonstration of how completely the legal understanding of this case had shifted, from a story about a jealous, calculating wife in 2011 to a story the courts ultimately treated as one of decades of psychological harm finally reaching its breaking point. Sally Challen's case is now widely studied as a turning point in how English law approaches victims of long-term psychological abuse who go on to harm the person controlling them. It helped establish that decades of coercive behavior can be directly relevant to a person's mental state and criminal responsibility, a principle that has since informed reviews of other cases involving women in similarly abusive relationships. Her sons, James and David, responded to the final outcome in very different but equally telling ways. In a statement read to the court, James said the family had lost a father and that they did not seek to justify their mother's actions, but that she did not deserve to be punished any further. David, who had spent years publicly campaigning on his mother's behalf, described the case as a landmark moment for how society understands the true severity of coercive control, and later wrote a book on the subject, drawn directly from what his own family had lived through. It is worth holding both parts of this case in mind at once, without letting either one erase the other. Richard Challen was a father, a husband of 31 years, a man who built a career and a family life, and he died at the hands of the person he had shared that life with. Sally Challen was, according to the courts that ultimately reviewed her case in full, a woman shaped by 40 years of control, so complete that the legal system itself had to change before her actions could be properly understood. Neither truth cancels the other out. Both are part of what actually happened. This case remains one of the clearest illustrations of how the law can lag behind lived experience, and of what can happen in the years, sometimes decades, before that gap is finally closed. It is a reminder, too, of how much can hinge on the specific moment a case happens to reach a courtroom. Had Sally Challen been tried even a few years later than she was, the entire legal conversation around her actions might have looked completely different from the very start. Instead, her case became the one that helped build that later understanding for everyone who came after her, a fact that neither undoes what happened to Richard Challen nor diminishes what Sally endured across 4 decades of her own life. If you want to understand how a British court can convict someone of murder in 1 decade and rule they were legally entitled to inherit their victim's estate in the next, that is exactly what this channel is for. Every day, we break these cases down properly, without the noise, so hit subscribe if that is something you want more of. Thank you for watching.